everyone, and welcome to the first ever Lit in Colour teacher conference held in partnership with Tes. This event is being filmed live, and therefore, if there are any technical problems or disconnections, we will be back as soon as possible. My name is Zahida Nabagarika. I'm Senior Lit in Colour Manager at Penguin Books, and I'm joined by Leslie Nelson Addy, Education Manager at Runnymede Trust. The Lit in Colour campaign was founded between Penguin Books and Runnymede Trust in 2020 with the aim of supporting UK primary and secondary schools to make the teaching and learning of English literature more inclusive of writers of colour. The first phase of the campaign involved commissioning research with an independent team based at Oxford University's Department of Education, investigating the barriers which currently prevent more books by writers of colour from being taught in the classroom in England. The research found that the key barriers for teachers include a lack of resources, budget, and time, as well as a lack of confidence and knowledge in knowing how to talk about race in the classroom. Overall, this results in a systemic underrepresentation of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic writers in the curriculum that's relative to both their place in contemporary British literary excellence, but also compared to the demographics of the school population.
Since then, Lit in Colour has been focused on bringing together different organisations across the educational sector to help facilitate meaningful change. We want to give direct support to schools and teachers with practical, inspirational, and effective tools and resources. This conference is all about building teacher confidence to talk about what it means to consciously engage with text by writers of colour in the classroom. Thank you to everyone who joined the secondary session this morning. This afternoon, we will have the primary reflective panel discussion, followed by an in-conversation with novelist Nazneen Ahmed Patuk. There will be opportunities to ask questions, so please use the chat function. After each session, a QR code will be shown on screen. Please scan it and enter all your details for a chance to win one of our book bundles. Please also share your thoughts and comments on social media using the hashtag LIC Teacher Conference and tag us at TES for Teachers and at Penguin UK Books. The teachers from the reflective sessions have also kindly compiled some top tips that they considered while engaging with the process of diversifying their curriculum content. These tips are great for personal use and can also be shared with your departments. I'm now going to introduce Rose Chanteluc, who is the chair for the primary reflective session. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you, Zahida. Hi, everyone. My name is Roseanne Chanteluc, and I'm an independent researcher. You can follow my work on Twitter at @rchanteluc. In 2021, I had the immense pleasure of working on the Penguin Lit in Colour research report, which many of you in this room may have come across. It may be part of the reason why you're here today. But today, I have the pleasure of chairing this primary reflective session. The main aim of this reflective session is to explore the internal and external barriers a range of English teachers and leaders have faced and overcome in order to incorporate more texts written by authors of colour in their classrooms and curriculums. Our wonderful panellists will share contextual detail about their professional journeys, their schools, as well as the process and their reflections on how they made these changes and the impact these changes have had. Before we dive in, I'm going to ask our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves. So I'll ask Karen, Luke, and then Omena to introduce themselves before we dive into the discussion.
Hello, I'm Karen Stringer, Deputy Head and Year 4 teacher in a school in Barrow-in-Furness. I deliberately started using texts of by authors of colour when we began a daily read aloud session in class. My school is predominantly white, 97% white, and doesn't really reflect the multicultural society we live in. And so I deliberately share stories from authors that pupils might not discover on their own. They're not the household names that children would recognise, such as Michael Morpurgo and Jacqueline Wilson. So we read books by Nazana Farouk and Maisie Chan, Nathan Byron, Anjali Ralph, etc. And it was an opportunity to expose them to exciting new authors who weren't a mirror of their lives, but were a window into unfamiliar worlds and perhaps unfamiliar lives, but reflect the lives of young people in Britain today. Thank you.
Thank you. And Luke, if you could introduce yourselves, and then Omena.
Absolutely. Okay, so my name is Luke Patterson. I'm a deputy head at St Mary's of St John's School in Hendon, which is in North London. It is very diverse. I started teaching in 2010, and I've had a range of roles over that time. Although I have personally engaged in teaching text by authors of colour, this certainly wasn't the focus when I first started teaching all those years ago. It's certainly become much more prominent as the years have gone by, and I sort of feel it's been made more of a priority in the aftermath of the George Floyd protests and over COVID. That whole period really sort of made it a lot more prominent now. That it ever has been, really. So what we have done is that we have gone through a process of really auditing the curriculum to ensure that it is more diverse. The starting point of this were looking at the chosen English text that the children were focusing on, and this provided a template for how we would map it out for some of the other subjects as well. Thank you.
Amanda, feel free to jump right in.
Yeah. Hiya, so I'm Omena Osibremu. I'm a primary school teacher, having taught across Key Stage 1 and 2, currently in South London, but taught across the UK and in Spain. I've been on a gradual journey, similar to Luke, about introducing more diverse texts as I've kind of gained more status in the profession. So, of course, starting off as a trainee, newly qualified teacher, you have limited say over the text you can use, but you can start to introduce through your personal book collections, and through the text that you read to the class. Then as I've taught topics, I've introduced books on that topic from diverse authors or about diverse peoples around that similar time. For example, Black people during the Victorian time. And then as I've kind of become a subject leader and had more say over the curriculum, I can now thread in particularly Black British history into the curriculum using texts like Black and British and adapting schemes and planning and things like that.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for sharing a bit of your journey and your story. I think one of the many things that unites your experiences is this gradual journey, this gradual movement towards diversifying the curriculum at the primary level. So I want to hear a little bit more from each of you around why you think that journey is gradual, why it takes so much time, what helps you to really shift from a place where you feel like you're lacking in confidence in this area to a place where you're implementing it in your practice and you're here today trying to encourage folks to do the same. Maybe we'll start with you, Luke.
Absolutely. So in terms of my own kind of confidence in teaching diverse texts, I did have a little bit of apprehension, and that was more just because of the parents. And the reason that being was there's many different parents have many different experiences about race, because it is such an emotive topic that's always been, certainly at the beginning part, it was always something that I was very mindful of and aware of. And I'll give you one example. So we did have a text which was called Jemmy Button, and the idea around this text is that there's a native child there living in South America, and his life takes a drastic turn. He's captured by British explorers, brought back to, one of which is Charles Darwin. He's brought back to England to quote unquote civilize him and present him as an example of their theories on cultural or colonization. He's taken away from his family, his culture, his homeland, and he embarks on a journey across the sea to England. And he's exposed to, a different world, vastly different from what he knows. Unfamiliar customs, clothing, way of life, and he's taught English manners and behaviours. Now, as time passes, he becomes more accustomed to his new life in England, but he remains conflicted between his native identity and the expectations placed upon him from the people who took him over to England. And the idea is that the story explores those themes of cultural displacement, identity, and the impact of colonization on Indigenous communities. and it really looks at his internal struggle, is portrayed alongside the curiosity and the questions that he has around him. And the book ultimately highlights the complex issues surrounding cultural appropriation, colonizations, and and the importance of understanding and respecting different cultures. And it's meant to serve as a reminder of the injustices faced by Indigenous peoples. Now, this was a Year 4 text that was being taught, and I suppose up until it was a couple of years ago that we had thought that that was something really to be celebrated. However, it was brought to our attention from a parent, a couple of parents, that they felt the book was glorifying British colonialism, and that was echoed by a few other people. So we had a review of that book, and we didn't feel that it glamorized it as more about it kind of asked questions around that, but we could see how it would be interpreted in that way. And upon reflection, we decided that before introducing a book such as this, more groundwork really needed to be done around colonialism, colonization, and the context of the book before introducing it. And so after we felt we did have a more robust way of teaching that, then we would go ahead and reintroduce that back into Year 4. Yeah.
Fantastic. There was so much in there, from the parents element to
Absolutely.
how to tackle these big themes, to curricular choices, and how responsive we are as educators when it comes to thinking about curricular choices that serve everybody. I really want to hone in on what you mentioned towards the start of your contribution, Luke, when you said that for a lot of parents, these themes around race, racism, colonization, cultural displacement feel very emotive and very heavy.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you, Amena, think about this idea that race and racism and these sorts of themes shouldn't be taught to primary level learners, because that is a thought that exists.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear your thoughts on that, Amena.
Yeah, I mean, I completely disagree that they shouldn't be taught, because children that are racialized as non-white, so black and brown, are experiencing that racialization from a very young age. And equally, as a black teacher, something I've always experienced and always was kind of that eye-opener to me was the minute I walk into a classroom, children say, "Oh, you're black," particularly where I'm from up north, and they've never seen a black teacher before. So children already have the language and they're already aware. A lot of people kind of underestimate children and say, "Oh, they don't know, they're not aware." They're very much aware when someone looks very different. But it's about giving them the language and saying that's okay, that's correct, I am black. How would you describe yourself? What does that mean? So giving them the language, the correct language, and the tools to discuss it, and discuss it in a way that we recognize that we have different opinions and different backgrounds. So I think it's about being able to hold the children, hold the class, and in turn also hold the parents. So recently, when I've had quite difficult discussions with my class around issues around race and racism, but also then what does that mean for us in our lived realities out in society and how people react to us, I've also shared with parents advice, for example, from Childline on how to talk to your children about racism, guidance perhaps monitoring what they're looking at online, discussing with the children about what maybe is or isn't safe to be searching up, particularly when I was looking at particular difficult histories, and saying I kind of wouldn't advise, looking at certain images or videos because it can be quite traumatic. But actually knowing these things, but building it slowly from our age as primary school children. So yeah, I would completely say, I mean, I think there's the saying in activism, if they're young enough to experience racism, they're young enough to talk about it. And so yeah, everybody needs to be, whether they're racialized as white or not, needs to be aware that these things are happening and how we can deal with them and how we can manage them.
Absolutely. And what you've just said reminds me of some of the interview feedback that I got when I was working on the Lit in Colour report, when primary educators were talking about the fact that it was playground incidents where you'd have young children sort of pointing out physical differences in their peers that brought the conversation of race and difference to the classroom. So as you said, they're already talking about it. It's about how do we equip young children with language and context. That work, as we know, is complex, and there's a confidence issue to address when we're thinking about what that work means and how we can do it well. So with that in mind, Karen, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what confidence means when we're talking about this work in the primary classroom, and how you work to develop your own confidence as a primary educator committed to talking about race and racism with young children.
Well, as a white person, you sometimes realise that you're discussing something you've not had personal experience of in terms of racism. I did work and live in Nigeria and Pakistan for 17 years, which gave me some insight. But I think, first of all, I have to recognise that I've got my own privilege, white privilege, and understand and appreciate diversity and celebrate and champion diversity in others. I think by immersing myself in experiences with other cultures and ethnicities and sharing that and bringing that into school, I think it helps develop my confidence. It's a continual process. There's not an end to it. You just need to be continually learning. And I think you have to be very open-minded about other people's perspectives. I think when you don't have necessarily the experience, you need to read extensively and read and research. It's a useful weapon. And by doing this, I think we can teach critically to think about race, challenge stereotypes, and have a perspective of the world that interrogates issues like institutional racism and structural oppression. And I think the more books you share with children, you're providing them with the means to address this. I think it's an ongoing process and we're always learning from it. I think one of the big barriers is sometimes fearing getting it wrong and therefore maybe shying away from even addressing it in the first place. And so I think we need to have a look at making sure we're using the correct terminology. And that's changed over time and it continually changes. And I think overcoming a fear of discovering our own cultural biases can sometimes stop us from actually discussing books of colour, authors of colour. I don't think it's necessarily easy at times, and I think it's something that can make you feel uncomfortable, and I think it's something you have to address. I think it's wonderful when you do start reading the books because there's so much to share, and the children really benefit from it, and it does provoke great discussion and great learning. Thank you.
We'll get to the individual books in a moment.
Oh yes.
We need to dive into which books spark which sorts of discussions. But on the subject of feeling this discomfort around this work, Luke, I'm keen to hear your perspective on this. Would you agree that this work is fundamentally work that evokes discomfort? And if so, what are some practices that you engage in as an educator to mitigate against that?
Sure. So, I mean, sort of echoing a little bit of what has just been said already, but certainly over the course of my career, like I said in the intro, race is far more prominent now than it sort of ever has been in sort of from what I'm seeing. Children are, as Amena said, far more conscious of race. And what I've seen is that racial terminology being used more frequently in the playgrounds, even sometimes, in classes or in the dinner hall, that sort of thing. But, it's not always, the children don't always know what it is they're actually saying. They certainly don't understand the context of it, or they won't necessarily even understand the weight that carries and the connotations that are around that. And so one of the things that sort of came to light last year actually was that I remember having this conversation with the whole of SLT, and another child had used a racial slur. Of course, they didn't know though that the weight that carried, and so we had to have a conversation around educating this child. And it turned out that some of the perspectives of some of the other children within the class as well, there was a real need there of education rather than the sort of consequence that is often put in place. And there was also a need of education with the parents as well. So that was also something that we had to sort of tackle as well. I will say the rise of like the internet, social media, those sorts of things, they're definitely unhelpful in this day and age, and sort of getting some of those misunderstandings of what is okay, what's not okay, and that sort of thing. Of what's being said. So I've definitely seen that, and that's something that we've really had to work hard on to tackle. And so we sort of encourage, anytime that we have seen that, we will have those or encourage the teacher or even myself to go into the class and have a class discussion based on that. And actually, before introducing some of these texts that might trigger some of these discussions around race, then I would definitely say to have that conversation with your classroom, with your children within your class, so that they do have an understanding of what is being said. But it does need to be tackled with, obviously, with sensitivity there.
Of course, and when you mentioned the challenge of language and terminology, to me, it's just incredibly fascinating that is a common thread, whether or not we're talking about the primary school context, the secondary school context, teacher training context, that the dynamic nature of language and wrapping your head around terminology that seems to be always shifting is something that I think across the board feels like a challenge to folks who are committed to this work. And thanks also for mentioning the internet and the social media presence as well, and what that can do for the broader communities that support the young children that we educate. Amena, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on other challenges that you feel like you've had to overcome, be it in the classroom, be it in the broader schooling community, as you've sought to teach themes around race and racism where you are up north.
Yeah, definitely. I'm actually in London now, but I'm from the north. I've kind of made my way down the country in terms of teaching. But yeah, I mean, a couple of things. When Luke was talking, I was really thinking about how I've really built my practice on laying the foundations to have these discussions and create that kind of safe space within the classroom. So I really link it to PSHE. We have ground rules for PSHE, which my children know as soon as we start any sort of discussion lesson, or I say, maybe there's themes and topics that are going to be sensitive. What are our ground rules? How do we show respect to other opinions, differences, and really emphasize, as Karen was saying, that actually our positionality as teachers, but also as the children to model for them, is going to impact on what I'm going to say, my experiences, maybe my perspective, because none of us are neutral, right? And we're all coming with experience and culture. And so I just say to them, my background, my family, my, religious and cultural, how might that impact what I'm going to say versus what might you say? So kind of modeling that positionality is really important. And within that, that's when you also model the language, not just the terms used, but also this idea of the us and them, trying to break that us and them. It's not us and them, it's all of us. And within that, we have kind of multiplicities. But in terms of my own experience, it's definitely been kind of an upward trajectory. I've had a lot of hostility from kind of colleagues, SLT in former schools. I've been blocked from teaching any kind of content that's anti-racist, decolonial. And so, yeah, with that, I've kind of had to tread carefully. And as we said, it's kind of an upward trajectory of how you build your confidence, but also how you build your curriculum knowledge. So you have such good curriculum knowledge that you can teach the curriculum and then also thread other things within it and still cover all of the kind of national curriculum content. So that's come with time. Being very kind of crafty about how you would bring in particular texts or peoples while still covering what's expected of you, if there is a bit more hostility from those around you. Unfortunately, sometimes being the only one that's doing that work in your school or year group, but still pushing forward with it because it has such an impact on the children and young people. And then when it's such a positive experience, other people see that and think, maybe I should be teaching ancient Benin, or, particularly when you've got demographics that come from that land space of Nigeria. But something this year that was really interesting, as Luke was saying, children are becoming more aware of language and how we kind of identify around race, particularly because of the internet. It's contested identities. So some children are saying, I identify as this, and other children say, you're not that. You're not part of us, And so I've really pushed for, actually, it's about self-identity as much as it's about how you're read. So within a context of, let's say, Jamaicans, particular children might not be read as Jamaicans, but they've been raised in a Jamaican family, and so they may self-identify with culture. Um, so yeah, being very specific to kind of empower children to self-identify and say, no, actually, I self-identify like this. You may see me as something else, but that's how I self-identify. And I think particularly around mixed race children, adopted children, children that are in care, that can become quite contested. So what I've kind of done to mitigate against that is, because I come from a mixed family, is to, at the beginning of the year, we talk about identity, say, this is my family. We all look different. We might be read differently, but this is how people choose to self-identify, kind of laying that foundation. So then later on in the year, when other children say, actually, I identify as this, but my family looks like this, you've already kind of started to have those discussions.
That is incredibly powerful what you've just laid out there in terms of the foundations that you lay and the real emphasis that you put on that at the start of the year. And you've also touched on the fact that there are various elements that need to be true in order for you to feel safe and able to do that. For example, support in the school site, for example, a robust curricular knowledge, own research and continuous individual improvement around how you engage with this topic. So thank you for sharing all of that, because that, of course, is a process that informs not only your practice in the classroom, but then the curricular choices that you make and the book choices that you make, which I am very, very interested to get onto and very keen to hear some individual texts. I know that Luke already offered up on earlier, but I'm really interested to hear the sort of texts that you've each been teaching in the classroom that have sparked the most interesting discussions with your primary learners. So Karen, perhaps we could hear from you about a text that sparked some interesting discussion.
I think the story that created the most discussion was the Line Above the Door by Anjali Ralph. It sparked a great discussion about racism, and even just about why was it called World War II when the textbooks just showed mainly white British men fighting. So where was the global aspect of this? In fact, it was great because by then we'd already read quite a lot of books by authors of colour, and we'd addressed quite a few racist issues. So it was brilliant in terms of the discussion that we had about it. But the story addresses the colonial view of World War II in a very child-friendly manner, and certainly questioned white privilege. The children were eager to learn about lost histories as a result of it, not just the lost history of World War II. You know, they wanted to know about the history we'd been learning about, and had there always been this idea of just seeing the world from a white man's point of view. And so the books addressed historical racism and contemporary racism. And I think that was an issue that really struck home. And the bullying of the two children of colour in a school that was white, the children could relate to it in terms of our school, but the bullying of these of Leo especially, who would be stared at when he went to the shops or when he was walking to school, it evoked indignation. And every time when we've ever had any indignation in class, they've always said, let's write a letter, you know, Miss, come and write a letter. And they felt very, very strongly about it as a result of it. The book also addressed the chronic disorder of vitiligo as well, which is the skin, you know, the skin condition where you lose the pigment, the colour of pigment, and it's much more obvious in people of colour. And this awareness as well helped develop children's empathy and understanding, and not just, I think it just broadened outlook considerably. And the best part of all was when we finished, they all wanted to take the book home, but one boy said, I need to share this with my mum. And I just thought that had a very, very powerful message. And one of the other stories was Race to the Frozen North, which shares the story of Matthew Henson, that's by Catherine Johnson. And it was great for exploring defying the odds to follow your dream and discovering the prejudice faced by Black people in the USA, certainly in the early 1900s, although that wasn't the only time. But the story of his success in reaching the North Pole and the fact it was suppressed simply because of the colour of his skin, again, it caused such outrage in the class. It was certainly something that the children became aware of other points of view, and it was so interesting for them to actually empathise with other people, and to see how people felt from a different point of view. It really was a very strong book for that. And the fact that Matthew Henson, he befriends the Inuits, and they've got this dark skin too, and the children were quite interested in learning about different cultures as a result of it. But the fact that Matthew Henson was, he hadn't really been to school, but he became a navigator, a translator, carpenter, craftsman. They just admired the will that he had to change his life circumstances in spite of all the barriers put in place. And I think it just was great for starting a discussion around racism, injustice. I know there are so many books I could say about, but I think those were the two particular ones that really had a very strong effect in the class.
Oh, I love that so much, Karen. I love the emphasis you placed on empathy and justice, and really sort of working with the inbuilt sense of empathy that we know that so many young children come to the classroom with, and working on that basis to think not only about these big themes, but then what do young children do when they have that empathy that's been evoked, and they have a text, they're thinking of big themes, they write a letter, they you know they can work together to produce something to take an action that feels like that they can take ownership of. That's incredibly special. Thank you for sharing those experiences. Luke, you mentioned a text earlier, and I am keen to hear the process for how you decide on which text to include and which ones not to include. I know you hinted at that a little bit earlier when you said that you got some feedback on that particular text.
Yeah.
In particular, I'm really keen to hear about the element of student or learner voice in your curriculum decision making.
Yeah, sure. So that's one of the things that we have a committee which is set up designed to talk about all things teaching and learning. And that's obviously one aspect of it. So, when we're looking and reviewing how a text is going, how a text has been, once every half term, we'll have a conversation. And within that conversation, we'll talk about, what text is being taught in English, how do you like it, that sort of thing. It's always sort of really interesting to hear the children's perspective on how they feel, that text is, whether it's a good text, they're engaging with it or not so much. It is always really interesting. And that certainly came through in the text that I was referring to before. Just on the point, though, around teaching of text and the choosing of texts, I just wanted to make this point quite clear, because quite often I find that it's often presented, there's a sort of debate, if you want, within the, I suppose, society when we talk about authors of color, and it goes like this, that you either teach classical or classic traditional texts, which are predominantly authored by white males, or you teach more modern texts, which are authored by people of color. That's quite often the binary argument that we find ourselves put in. And you're sort of forced to, where do you sort of stand on that? Now, I have always come at that argument as, well, the children need exposure to both. It's not a binary argument. I don't think it needs to be put in that way. And what I have tended to do is, in addition to that, is I'll look at traditional texts from different countries from around the world. And that kind of, I suppose, it sort of does both at once. You've got those traditional texts, but they're also from authors of color. It's not to say that children shouldn't have exposure to classic English texts, but it is to say that they should also have exposure to texts from all over the world. And sort of as a starting point for that, it would be just look at the demographics of your children and then sort of work outwards from there. One example of that is that one of the books that we do teach that has always been really popular with the children is a book called African Tales. And for anyone who's not familiar, I'd say it's pitched years 3, year 4, round about that kind of level, and it's an anthology. An anthology of 8 traditional tales from all over Africa. It's very nicely illustrated. It's well written, and the children do really get a lot out of that text, and it's always sort of one of the most interesting texts that really goes down well when we do that student voice. They always really like that that text. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. And Amena, could you also offer an example of a text that you've included and also a bit of insight as to how you got to those curricular choices?
Yeah, well, I've got a couple of favourites at the moment because they cover so much. So David Alasoga's Black and British, because it kind of covers all the particularly historical areas of the curriculum that you will teach across primary, actually, and shows where Black people have been involved and hidden, missed from that history. So I think it's almost like a reference book. I keep on my desk and I pull out whenever we have a new topic, like, hey, look, so actually there were Black Romans, throughout the different histories. Similarly, also Vashti Harrison's Big People, Little Leaders. The children love those because of the illustrations. She cartoonizes everybody. And that's a really good one for cross-curricular, because then you can do self-portraits of themselves in that illustrative style. And then also I built on some Black artists on top of that to do the backgrounds. So they love those sorts of ones. Again, reference books that you can pick up to support your teaching of all sorts of people. For example, we did Catherine Johnson in the space topic around the space race and hidden figures. Maybe a little bit controversial though. The most interesting book I've taught recently is not by a writer of colour, and this is the point I also wanted to make. In the kind of decolonial space, it's not necessarily about almost tokenistically adding people of colour, but it's also about diversity of thought. So the book was The Island by Armand Greda, who's an Australian writer, but the whole book is about immigration, xenophobia, how people on an island respond to a newcomer who doesn't look like them, and the conversations we could have, and particularly the parallels we could make to the British Isles and what's happening politically, how we treat newcomers that are coming to our island, and the debates we could have. Do we welcome them? Do we not? How much humanity do we show to others? Do we need to show? Are we responsible for showing? That was a really kind of poignant moment for me. Again, it's the diversity of thought, not necessarily just the authors. So if they're covering topics from critical perspectives, particularly text, because it's quite a simple picture book with a few lines on each page, but that leaves a lot of inference open for the children, particularly in year 5, year 6. They can then start inferring, well, why did the author use that image and just that word? What does that mean? What are all the multiple kind of possibilities? So yeah, that was a really great text.
I love the emphasis on cross-curricular links and thinking about that as informing how you go about choosing text and teaching text. I'm wondering whether there are other mechanisms or tools that you as educators use to make your teaching of diverse text and diverse thought more effective and inspirational. For example, collaborations with other schools or external partners, trainings, etc. What other external mechanisms inform how you go about this teaching? Maybe Karen, if you want to start, and Luke and Omini can have a think about that question too.
We're very fortunate because we've had a link with a school in South Africa, Metse Abapello. It's in Mamelodi. It's a Black township school. And we've had a two-way exchange of teachers. I've gone there and with other teachers from the school and taught in the classrooms there, where 64, 65 children in the class is nothing. And then they've come over to us and we've had video links and exchange of stories and songs and choirs, and we've built up a really strong positive relationship, and that's certainly helped us. And I think it's quite unusual for a primary school to have these exchanges, and I think that's been really important for us. And then in terms of the wider curriculum, we're always, as a school, looking for ways in which to broaden the experience the children have. So we're in art, it tends to be really very much focused around white male European artists. So we include artists such as St. James, who designed the first Kwanzaa stamp, or Althea McNeish, who was the first Black British textile designer, to earn an international reputation, and her work is absolutely wonderful. Or Faith Ringgold, with her beautiful quilts, but also her storybooks like Tar Beach and Aunt Harriet's Underground Railroad in the Sky. Bisa Butler, Yinka Shonabari, Jean-Michel Basquiat. I mean, there's so many. Alma Thomas. Oh, I love Ella Natsui's work, and the children love it as well. And I think, and Yayoi Kusama. And I think the colour that comes through really engages the children. And then I think Omena already mentioned about Katherine Johnson's work, the mathematician who helped put astronauts on the moon. We all know about who landed on the moon, but do we really know who actually helped calculate the flight path for NASA's first Apollo moon landing? The person who actually made it happen. Oh, the wonderful Maggie Aderin Pocock, the British scientist who designed the scientific instruments and systems for space missions. I think it's just making sure that we include everybody when we're discussing anything. In history as well, there's a wonderful new book by Raksha Dave called Lessons from the Ancestors. And I know David Olusoga has already been mentioned, and I think his work is absolutely fantastic in a spotlight on forgotten histories and misrepresented stories. They celebrate equality and inclusivity across the world. There's the Black Pharaohs, Tahaka. We always learn about all the white pharaohs, but we forget about some of the Kush sites like Nuri that have long been forgotten. And even in Roman Britain, the archaeological and written evidence shows it was a multicultural place where Black faces were seen right across the whole strata of society in places such as Cumbria, where I'm from, and York, London, South Coast. And actually, in actual fact, when I brought this up with the children I was working with, they said, oh, migration's nothing new. Why is all the fuss now about migration in the news? And it was a great starting point from that point of view. And there's also the Black Curriculum series of books, like Migration. That's another great one that's used for historical reference. And then, of course, music, the universal language of music. We had the drummer Zozo Shoebo, who shared his work about the djembe and the music of West Africa, and that was wonderful. And then, of course, poetry. There's so many great poets out there. Valerie Bloom, Kwame Alexander, Ruth Awolola, Grace Nichols, John Agard. And I know if you're not confident in sort of reciting these poems in the patois that they've been written in, there's some great videos out there, and often free on the CLPU website, that show the poets performing their own poems, and so that you can give children the experience of hearing it firsthand. And I think we need to foster this culture of diversity and truly represent the society we live in right across the curriculum.
Thank you so much, Karen, for such a rich response of all of those examples of all of the different resources that you draw on where you sit in the country to really enhance your diverse teaching of literacy in the classroom. I am going to ask one more question to Luke and to Omena, and then I encourage you in the audience who are watching to feed your questions through so that I can make sure that your questions are also being raised in this space in the remaining time that we have left. Whilst Karen was talking, it had me thinking a lot about regional context, as we know, as we sit in this country's tiny island with lots of very big regional differences. It makes me think about the influence of geographical region on the ways in which we go about our teaching, particularly of choosing text and looking for resources, looking for partnerships that really speak to the sort of education that we want to give our young people about what diversity means today. Luke, I'm keen to hear from you as a member of SLT in your community, how where you sit geographically in the country informs the sort of conversations you have with SLT and with the school more broadly around diversifying your curriculum.
Yeah, sure. So I'm in a school in northwest London, so it is naturally quite diverse. We've got a large proportion of children who are from Eastern Europe, increasingly from Ukraine. We had quite a few, an influx of Ukrainian children because of the war. We've had an increase in people from Hong Kong. We've got a large Jamaican community, as well as Nigerian, and actually all over Africa, actually. And in terms of sort of how we engage in it, so I suppose sort of off the back of what Karen has said, when we're going through and we're choosing texts, or we're choosing which topics to cover within the curriculum, the demographics of the children is always, I suppose, the first thing, because we always feel that the curriculum sort of needs to represent, serve the community that come to our school. So that would always be the kind of starting point from there. So, for example, we've recently included the Benin Kingdom as a history topic in Year 5. We've done the same thing across a number of other year groups as well. Another thing as well that I raised a couple of, well, actually it was last year, and we're going to look to change that for this year, is the house system that we have. So we have six houses, and they're all named after significant people. The people that they're named after are all white males, which obviously doesn't serve the community that we have. So the idea being that this year, well, we could sit down with the children and come up with a better way of doing that, one that does serve our community better and reflect our children. And just on the idea around collaborating with schools, I've worked with another school, and what they have introduced, and we're now looking to introduce as well, it kind of encapsulates everything that Karen was saying, with all the different approaches that she mentioned there. And it's the diversity map, and each subject within the curriculum has a diversity map, and on those diversity maps would be all the different things that Karen has spoken about, and that was reviewed in this other school. That was reviewed every year. But what it did do, it provided teachers with a lot of confidence in being able to, oh, okay, so it's history, year 4. Oh, right, okay, got to make sure, to include this or to include this. There's more for, I suppose, guidance for some teachers who may not be as confident, with diversifying the curriculum as others.
Marvelous. Thank you so much, Luke. I'm just being pinged with some audience questions. Thank you so much, everybody, for sending these through. I'm going to try and address a couple, and Amena, I hope you don't mind taking our first audience question. So one question that's come through is about stereotypes. We have an audience member who's asked, what stereotypes do you come across from students most often in the classroom, and how do you deal with them in the moment?
Wow, stereotypes. I mean, it depends on the area massively. Like we're saying, it depends on the area, the demographics. So where I'm teaching at the moment, Southeast London, there's a lot of stereotypes around young Black men, and kind of what they're doing on the streets, and all that kind of the criminalization, the gang culture, the kind of music that's coming from those contexts. And I'm very conscious, because I teach lots of young Black boys, to kind of highlight where stereotypes might come from, or where particular behaviours might denote to other people a stereotype. So we have a lot of discussions around how might others see us if we behave in a certain way, if we're listening to drill and we're doing all these hand signs and whatever. Like, what do other people think about it? It's not necessarily right, but what are people putting on us? Also kind of trying to build their, like we're talking about, their language and their understanding of how the world is gonna and is already racializing them. So yeah, I mean, in my context at the moment, it's pretty much mostly around Blackness, stereotypes around Blackness. What does it mean to be Black and British? What does it mean to be Nigerian, for example? There's a lot of parent culture versus, particularly because I'm from that demographic as well, like our parents coming as migrants, expecting us to live in a certain way, but actually here in Britain, we have a different culture almost. And so kind of addressing that there are generational differences, and our parents might think a certain way of experiencing certain things, but here it's a little bit different. And so we have to try and kind of go between the two of the different cultures that we have. But yeah, in terms of race, I'd say those are the biggest ones, really. I think, yeah, there's way more to do with gender, for example, but in terms of race and racism, that's it.
Can I just respond to that as well, that question? Is that all right?
Of course, yeah.
So one of the things in terms of those stereotypes that I've experienced, again, this came up a couple of years ago, was that a child came in and said something quite derogatory about Black people. But what was really curious was this child's, her best friend was Black, and she'd hung around with a lot of the other Black children. I didn't get a sense. So, you thought, okay, well, let's unpick this a little bit. And when we'd unpicked it, it had actually come from the parent, and they were literally just repeating what the parent had said to them. And of course, then that kind of, I suppose it harkens back to my previous point around having to educate both the child and the parent. Now, with the child, it was quite straightforward because it was really easy to kind of dispel that, because it was like, well, is that true? Is that accurate? Well, what are you actually saying? And they actually thought about it and said, oh, yeah, well, no, that's not true. No, clearly. And then with the parent, that was a phone call and this and that. Now, obviously, parents are parents. I don't know if that it will change within their their paradigm, but certainly it didn't resurface, which was good. But I just wanted to make the point that sometimes those stereotypes, where they're coming from, is sometimes it does come from the parents, and they are not necessarily the views of the pupils, especially the younger children, I'd say.
Fantastic. And I think the word unpicking is key here. I know that the stereotype question comes up a lot. And once again, that's another through line that cuts through not just primary, but secondary. And I think this idea of how do we as educators equip students and young learners with the tools to think about this received language that they're using is one way to approach stereotypes in the moment. Couple of questions coming from the audience on book choice. So I just want to remind everybody that the Penguin Lit in Colour project does have some recommended reading lists on the website. So do feel free to check those out. There are ones specifically for primary, broken down by key stage, and they've been updated year on year. So do check those out. Absolutely wonderful texts are recommended there. And a teacher in particular has asked for recommendations of a class read aloud chapter book for year 3, and I've actually got a response to this that's also come through. So this was shared by Karen a little earlier, so I hope you don't mind me speaking your words, Karen, but Karen recommends to this teacher, this year 3 teacher, to start with Anisha, Accidental Detective by Serena Patel, because it provides wonderful insight into a Hindu family living and adapting to life in England. So that's Anisha, Accidental Detective by Serena Patel. Probably got time for one very quick question, and then we will have to wrap things up. So with that in mind, another audience question that I'd love to hear Karen's thoughts on is, do you have a personal favourite text that you have taught in the classroom throughout your career, and why?
Oh my goodness, it's very hard to choose a favourite text, I think. I'm just trying to, I think possibly Danny Chung Does Not Do Maths, and as maths coordinator, I was intrigued by the title of the book in the first place, and it's a Maisie Chan book, and I just love the idea of how generations adapt to living in the UK. I know Luke mentioned about the generational differences, and I think this is one of the stories, and I think this book just tickles me really with the stories and the humor that's inside it, and where the Chinese grandma comes along, her name the Chinese name for her grandma is Nai Nai, and she comes along with very little, well, no English at all. And it reminds me of my own grandma, and just the fact that she brought chicken feet soup to the boy in his primary school for his lunch, and just the horror that the other children saw about this particular dish and the way that it was dealt with very sensitively. And I just think that's one of the books that became a favourite of mine, just from the storytelling, and also it was a favourite of the class that I used it on as well. Thank you.
Oh, that's brilliant. I love that response so much that I kind of want to pose the same question to Luke and Amena.
Sure. Okay. Well, I don't know if my favorite, but I will say I really, really do adore this book, and it's called Look Up, and it's by Nathan Bryan. It's pitched for year one. It's the year one text that we use. We introduced it, I think, last year, I want to say. But it's got some of such nice positive themes around it. It's about a little black girl who's aspiring to be an astronaut, and obviously you've got there the themes around gender, and that idea around girls aspiring. I know that there's a big push for girls getting into the STEM subjects and that sort of thing, and looking up to the stars and all of that. It's about the relationship between her and the dad, her and her brother. She has to try and stop her teenage brother, from being on the phone all the time. So it's that very sort of recent relevance. But the way it's done is just so lovely, and it really is. I think that was the book that all the children said was their favorite story. And so I definitely recommend that book for any of the sort of Key Stage 1 teachers out there.
I love the fact that for both you and Karen, the favourite books for you to teach were the ones that were the favourites for the children that you were teaching. Very, very telling. It resonated all around. How about you, Amena? Favourite text?
I think I'm more like history, upper Key Stage 2. So mine's, as I mentioned before, Vashti Harrison's Little People, Little Leaders, Big People, Little Leaders. And she does one on exceptional Black men and bold women. And I think, again, it's a really good starting point for even educators who don't know about so many of these people. Then you can weave them in. And also just the illustrations the children love. They love to kind of just look at it, let alone, so it's very accessible even for kind of lower ability learners, as well as read. And it just covers so many different stages through history and different kind of countries and continents. So I would use those as kind of reference points, and always have.
What I really appreciate about the different texts you've all recommended is that they are treating the questions around identity in very different ways. So you've got the text that you just mentioned, Amena, which is very much about sort of like excellent achievements and accomplishments. But then we also have texts that are being taught to children that are about adapting to different cultures. And we also have texts that are about families just living their day-to-day lives. And I think it's important to think about not just the diversity of authors being represented in curriculums or the diversity of the characters, but also the diversity of experiences of people of colour that are being treated in the text. If all the texts that we choose are all about exceptionalism or all about the complexities of cultural displacement, we might need to reflect on what overarching narrative that might be feeding to our young children. So I really appreciate just the difference out there, and it just speaks to the huge variety of texts that are out there at the primary level for everyone to dig into. Okay, more audience questions. I'm loving this, and we do have more time, I've been told, so we can get into the meat of all of these brilliant questions. So thinking less about individual books and thinking more about support at schools as needed to really cultivate this work that you've just spoken about. I've got a question from somebody in the audience about how do you deal with hesitance or resistance from colleagues? I think, Amena, you mentioned this explicitly earlier. I don't know whether you want to speak in a bit more detail about how you actually dealt with that resistance. And I'll pose the same question to Luke as well, as a member of SLT at your school.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It really depends on your position in the school. So as a kind of a class teacher or subject leader, I've always kind of almost led from example. So you kind of have to prove it works and it's a positive experience, and the children gain a lot from it. So For example, when I changed the year group curriculum to include ancient Benin, and no one had heard of it, they would just, it was quite a new topic. It's more popular now, but it was quite a new topic, limited resources. And I had to kind of show, not only is it cross-curricular, not only can the children bring in so much of themselves, because so many were Nigerian, and as well as my own self, but also that it can be very successful and you share that. So I literally, had a learning showcase. And then when other people see that kind of success and vibrancy, and they're like, okay, I want to be part of that too. I think something else I've done, so I've done some work with kind of publishing and talks and supporting trainee teachers, is kind of almost hand-holding, kind of showing, okay, this is what you can read, this is a text you can use, here's a plan that I've used, you can adapt it. So really kind of supporting people, particularly when you're colleagues as co-teachers. Hey, I've had a go at this, why don't you have a go? Or I've got this text that's really interesting, why don't you try? So kind of being supportive of each other and trying to learn from each other, because nobody's going to have all the answers. And also, as someone mentioned, being reflective. So if it doesn't work or go so well, being able to bounce off each other. So I've had colleagues come and say, actually, had a difficult discussion, not sure it went particularly well. How would I, go back in and tackle that? And just, constantly being responsive to the children and each other.
I love that, the importance of reflective practice for really opening up a space of collaboration with colleagues and sharing resources, and also attesting to the proof of the pudding being, how young children are really engaging with these texts and what it's meaning for them. All of these things can really culminate to maybe chip away at some discomfort that might come up from other colleagues who are less attracted to the work that we are all committed to doing here. Luke, any insights from you around how to deal with that hesitancy that we were speaking about?
Yeah, sure. So the hesitancy that sort of come my way has been really not seeing, I guess, the importance of the diversification of the curriculum, of introducing these texts, etc., etc. So what tends to happen is that sometimes the passion, if you want, of the way it's delivered isn't always delivered as exuberant as it would be for other areas of the curriculum that do interest them. I would say this though, that as I was saying about the increase in the sort of racial language for the children, that has kind of that, because that is certainly on the rise within the school, it has heightened people's sort of, oh, okay, right, yeah, it is a kind of problem. Oh, okay, yeah, we better go and do something. However, I will say this, then there's a hesitancy, okay, we know what the problem is, but there's a hesitancy to do anything about it. So it may be that, okay, well, what's the block there? What is it that you're sort of struggling with? And normally what I found is it's because they feel uncomfortable having that conversation, right? And they're not confident around having that conversation. And so in those circumstances, whenever I sort of pick that up, I'll always offer to go in and have that almost model that conversation for that teacher. So I've done that on several occasions where I've gone in, to the whole class, and we've had a 50-minute discussion about that with the teacher there. And I'll try and bring that teacher in and bring that teacher along, and so that they themselves are developing that confidence as well, because it for their own professional development, but also for the children as well. So that's really the sort of what the approach that I've taken when seeing that hesitancy.
I think it's a really interesting angle when you mentioned professional development as having a part to play in approaching this with colleagues potentially. It's about partially about how can we support colleagues and teachers in using the sorts of discussions, contextual information, subject knowledge, and drawing on all of these different sources of knowledge to have conversations that are difficult and complex, and and the language around which is always sort of changing. There is a professional development question there, as you said. These things are skills that we're talking about, and they're not necessarily sort of nice to have chats that we're having with young children, because people feel like there's a real art and importance in having these conversations, doing them well, not just with peers, not just with young children, with parents as well. So
And just on that, I will also say that when it's been left, which there was just one, I'm thinking in my head, when it was left, it got a lot worse. So if something was said and it wasn't picked up, or it wasn't, and that because they didn't want to have that conversation, then it did grow and it sort of spread into something. Whereas if we just had the conversation in the first place, it wouldn't, it would have mitigated a lot of issues there.
Thank you so much. Another question that in a way sort of relates to what you were saying, Luke, in terms of the impact of the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement on this new momentum around this sort of work, is somebody has in the audience has pointed out the fact that the primary level we're not as constrained to these subject specific blocks as our secondary colleagues are. So with that in mind, why hasn't there been this experimentation with diversifying literature at the primary level before? What do we think might have been stopping that work from happening before that Black Lives Matter moment in 2020, given the diversity and the fluidity of a primary curriculum? It's a head scratcher, isn't it?
I mean, can I just a quick one? I think from what I've seen, there has been a huge influx of literature, particularly for children, but even just in general, Black British literature since Black Lives Matter. Maybe that's because, well, it is, I think, because more people are being published. More of these stories are actually people are putting money behind them. So I have really seen an explosion. I mean, when I was young, my mum had to bring in books from America that were diverse. So there's really been a gradual explosion in Britain of more diverse texts and more kind of awareness of them, I would say.
Yeah, can I go? Yeah, so I think as well, I was just thinking of what life was like before BLM and before COVID. And I think when that happened, obviously it started in America, and it started primarily with police brutality on Black people. And then if you remember, it just kind of exploded into every facet of society. And you had questions and campaigns around why isn't there the diversification of boardrooms. So it's all the way up. Every single layer of society had been affected by that, including sort of sparking the where we are now, which has been a really positive journey. But that momentum wasn't there, and that focus wasn't there in the mainstream as it was, because it kind of was in there were pockets. It's not to say that nobody was doing anything, because there were pockets, and there were people who have been writing literature for authors of color, and have been putting things out there, but it never got the traction that it did now, because of, I suppose, the mainstream hadn't really it hadn't got that traction within the mainstream, and now I feel that it obviously has.
Karen, would you agree with that? When you think about the relationship between primary education and mainstream conversations, would you agree that there's been pockets of work at the primary level around this, but it really took this big moment to shift the needle in the classroom?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it suddenly people realised the importance of addressing racism. But prior to that, the majority of history books, and I think the person is asking about why history in local areas might have, it hadn't been, history hasn't really been addressed from different points of view. And I think part of the reason is it was written by white men from, even I remember going to an exhibition about Egypt, and the people hadn't even been to Egypt, and they were these white men were writing about Cleopatra and imagining what she looked like just from their own personal point of view. And I think there's been so much history written from white man's perspective without any other consideration. And I think that's why diverse literature cross-curricular hasn't really been considered prior to that, but there were always pockets where people were addressing it. But it needed the Black Lives Matter to really bring it to a head, I think, and make sure that everybody was addressing it.
I'm so pleased that you brought up the question of history, because we have a wonderful audience question about history, thinking less about big capital H history and thinking about local histories and what focusing on local history in our local areas can do for our teaching of literature. So the audience member is asking you all, how else have you engaged with local history in your schools areas? Amena, would you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah, well, it is particularly history, but also geography. It's a topic where you have to look at like local histories, local area. So we kind of do that across primary anyway. But I would say in terms of literature, depending on what area you're in, you can really bring in particular topics. So for example, I'm in Lewisham, and there was the kind of Lewisham uprisings. And that's a really interesting topic to get the children talking about resistance in the area. And then you can draw on key figures within kind of British resistance, as the move is always to go to America. And as I kind of mentioned before, also bringing in like local cultures, what is happening in your area, whether it's recent history or it's current. Because children, young people, particularly Key Stage 2, love what's happening currently. Who are the artists? Who are the rappers? Who are the music makers that are in this area? It's all about role models and who they're going to aspire to, and what sorts of things they want to start doing, because you kind of mentioned the impact of online is really being felt, and for me it's particularly America and American TikTok, and really I'm trying to like counter that with, hey, but you know, here we've got some local artists doing really positive things, and of course in Manchester Marcus Rashford is doing incredible things, always trying to show them the alternative, because they're being exposed to so much that's going on elsewhere. So yeah, I would say bringing in histories, geographies, and also culture.
I love that. It's about people as well as place. Luke, were you going to say something in response to that as well?
Yeah, no, just that in terms of the local history, where I am, we're very close to the RAF museum, and that has sparked a lot of one of the topics that's taught higher up, years 5 or 6, about World War II. But because of the RAF museum, it sparks the focus around black pilots within World War II. So I suppose that would be a kind of example of how the local history has sort of impacted what we are doing. And obviously that's one of the trips that the children will go on as well.
Brilliant. And we've got one more audience question, and it's about cross-curricular activities. There's a lot of interest in the conversation we were having earlier about cross-curricular activities, and obviously the primary curriculum lends itself so well to making all of those links in the ways that Amanda described earlier. Karen, do you have any other examples of cross-curricular activities that have really worked when collaborating with your colleagues?
Oh, goodness me. I mean, it's usually art that seems to be the easiest for cross-curricular, where you can perhaps start with a novel and then lead on to art. But generally, artwork can really help. Perhaps some of the work by the Underbelly designs of Esther. Oh, just trying to think of her surname, Esther Malangu. You know, that can help, and especially because we're linked with a school in South Africa, it helped across the range to perhaps look at some of the South African artists and produce some of the work. And the designs are quite geometric. It sort of ties in with maths. There's quite a lot of cross-curricular work that you can do around her work. Yeah, I think that's possibly one of the easy ones to perhaps use. And I also am a personal fan of Yayoi Kusama, and I do love her dotty worlds and seeing the world through a different perspective. And I think the children sort of engage with this quite easily. But I think basically anything can be used. Any of the ones can be used, really quite cross-curricular. But it's just a matter of spending some time and having a look at some of the work and deciding what you can use with it. We used, for example, Yinka Shonabare's work. He uses some lovely Nigerian cloth to make things, but he also made some little miniature books and did a little project called the British Library. We then used his cloth to make little tiny books, miniature books, and then use them for poetry writing and collecting specific words. So there was another sort of cross-curricular link that you could use.
These are incredible examples, and feeding on from the PSHE and history and music example that we discussed earlier, we've got some really rich examples of art as a connective piece there. Luke, I saw you nodding your head vigorously when Karen was talking about art. It seems as if that really resonated with you as a cross-curricular link.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to sort of follow on. I mean, absolutely, art does lend itself DT as well. And I was also just going to say, don't be afraid to also incorporate creative writing, because some of the most creative pieces of writing have come out of, history, geography, RE. And those are things such as diary entries, retelling of particular events. Newspaper articles are always pretty good, them pretending to be journalists, that sort of thing. Persuasive texts. Poetry, all of those, they really do. You do get some really rich content from the children. So don't be afraid to use those for creative writing as well.
Yeah, and I would just add, you've mentioned kind of all the creatives, art, music, and dance. Of course, lends itself to so many things, whether it's the context of something, even if it's not related to the text, but it's the context of the text, or it's within a similar history, or even just playing the music in the classroom. I often do that before they recite poetry or they read a piece, or even just reading the text to kind of add the context and the understanding. So, for example, I taught Freedom Bird and we looked at Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and that was my hook at the beginning. Play this, who's talking, whose perspective is it from, what are they saying, what's the context, and then build on from that.
I'm truly loving all of these examples. It's reminding me of when I was conducting some of the Lit in Colour report interviews, and I was talking to primary teachers, and they were talking about their positions as generalists, and saying that on one hand, that can really impact on their feeling of like being an expert of a particular subject. But on the other hand, given everything we've just discussed, this is the beauty of being a primary educator, is that you have this fluidity. You're able to make connections between all of these different subjects with your colleagues quite organically. So thank you so much for all these examples. We are about to wrap up, unless we get any more questions from the audience. But before we do, I've got one final question that I would love each of you to answer. And that is, if think about an audience member who's been thinking very, very deeply about this work, but hasn't quite taken that first step in their school to having that conversation or auditing that curriculum or buying or thinking about buying the different texts, what would be one piece of advice that you would give that teacher who's thinking of moving from the theory of diversifying the curriculum into the practice of doing it?
I'd say try it out and you'd be amazed. Just give it a go. Don't be afraid. Just go for it, I think.
Yeah, I'd say the first step would just be, when you're doing those, class reads at the end of the day, just choose a book from an author of colour. That would be the very first step.
Yeah, and building from that, if you're talking more specifically around planning and like curriculum choice, I would say, and something we didn't mention is the schemes. Schools all use different schemes, right? So I'd know your scheme. I would get maybe an overview of the scheme, and usually within that, like within the national curriculum, there are suggestions that are actually diverse, and then you can go to whoever makes those decisions and say, I've looked at the scheme, it says that we could do this, why don't we have a go,
Superb. That is it for this primary reflective session, everybody. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much to each of our panelists, Karen, Luke, and Omena, thank you so much. And to all of you in the audience for this rich discussion. We are now heading to a short break. You will come back at 3:40 if you're interested in hearing the conversation between Matthew Courtney and Nazneen Ahmed Patak about her debut novel, City of Soul and Magic. So come back at 3:40 for that conversation. In the meantime, please do not forget to scan the QR code to secure your book bundles. Thank you so much, everybody. And thanks again to Karen, Luke, and Amina. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Matt Courtney and I'm really excited to be here today. I am the English Hub lead at the Wandle English Hub, which is based in Cheston Primary School in Battersea. And I'm really, really excited to be talking today with Nazneen Ahmed Partuk about her brilliant work. Nazneen is a British Bangladeshi writer, historian and visual artist who lives in Southampton. She has a PhD in Bangladeshi literature from the University of Oxford. As a historian, she researches the geography and history of migration, a subject which is also close to her heart, and much of her fiction, poetry, and visual arts practice, which we're talking about today. So welcome, Nazneen. Really excited to talk to you today.
Hi, Matthew. It's really wonderful to be here.
Really excited to be talking to Nazneen about the publication of her recent amazing book, The City of Stolen Magic. If you haven't read it yet, really recommend getting your hands on a copy. Try not to give away too many spoilers today as we delve in. And as Nazneen's waving, I've got my well-thumbed copy here next to me too. We try not to give too many spoilers away today as we discuss it. So Nazneen, the first question I had for you, as we've just seen, is the book has a beautiful front cover, but also inside there's lots of lovely illustrations throughout. I was wondering what made you opt for a multimodal novel?
Yeah, it's absolutely. I have to say so myself. It's an absolutely gorgeous cover, illustrated by Sandhya Prabhat, who is an Indian origin illustrator who is based in the US, and she's really done the story justice in terms of the cover, but also we have some gorgeous maps that have been made by another illustrator who's called Leah. And yeah, there are chapter head illustrations all the way through, and then big kind of full page illustrations in each part. And I think there are multiple reasons why we have such so much illustration in this work. Partly because this is, we're still coming out of lockdown. So there is, and I'm sure some of the teachers who are listening may be aware that, there is still some kind of impact being felt in schools in terms of literacy and literacy targets in terms of the children who had spent a lot of time on their own in lockdown. So it is useful to have a lot of illustrations in a book that is quite fairly challenging. It's fairly chunky for a middle grade. But also the fact that I felt like this book is not just for Indian heritage children, it's for all readers. And so there are bits of this story that are not going to be unnecessarily easily visualizable, if that's a word, for children from different backgrounds. So the bits that are set in Bangladesh may not be kind of things that can be easily visualized by readers who've never been there, but also the bits in London. This book has just been published in India as well, so it's they may not be easily imagined by readers there. So the illustrations give everyone some way into the story.
Thanks, Nazneen. I absolutely love books with maps. I just think about maps in
I
a book.
got two. I keep being really proud when everyone says, "Ooh, maps! We love maps in a book." But I actually have a surprise one that comes right at the beginning of part 4, which is not a spoiler, so that everyone knows that it is coming up. So there's one of Dhaka and there's one of London. So there
Absolutely
are two
love
maps.
At the end of the novel, you include Lisa's guide to understanding the Ingresi language. What is your novel communicating about the impact of empire on language?
So one of the novels I was really influenced by when I was writing this book is an adult novel. Well, it's a series of novels by the amazing writer Amitav Ghosh. So he wrote these books called sorry, my daughter's here because she's not had a very good nap, so she's very grumpy. But now she's interested in my headphones. So the Amitav Ghosh wrote these books, which were set in kind of the 19th century, and they are amazing in terms of looking at kind of representing a hybrid Hindi, Urdu, English kind of language that's spoken by sailors on the ships across the world between the kind of 18th and 19th century. That all these key kind of communities that were kind of mingling together on the ships they were actually kind of cosmopolitanism in real life, and they were exchanging language as well as culture and community all the time. And so it's not just that, you know, English is now one of the national languages of India as a result of colonialism, but actually the fact that English itself has been marked and changed by the interaction and the encounter with India. So we have so many Indian words in English that we use without even realizing they're from South Asian languages. So veranda, bungalow, I could keep going on. There's so many. And, you know, it just demonstrates how empire colonialism is a kind of a meeting of cultures that then get mixed together, and that no one comes out of that kind of encounter unchanged, and that has resulted in the society and the languages that we're speaking today.
Thanks, Leslie. I think that's a theme that's really kind of prominent throughout the novel. So it's great to talk about that. There's a moment in the book, again, trying not to give too many spoilers away, but just before the 19th chapter, there's a moment, kind of vignette, where the boy and the doll is mentioned. And London, what is one of the sections of the novel, is the only part of the novel which begins in this way. Could you elaborate for us, why did you decide to start this section off in this way?
I had lots of discussions with my editors about this particular section. It was really funny that it was picked up on as a story, as a question, because yeah, it is a bit of an odd little fragment, and I think it is actually a bit of a darling in that way, because it doesn't really fit, but it was a section that I wrote that really visualized a particular type of magic that isn't necessarily, I don't have space to really explore it elsewhere in that story, though suggestions might be coming up in another answer I give, but about future stories. But also that I just felt like it was a way of kind of visualizing how scary, you know, people taking children is, you know, and that kids are just going around, they're just in their everyday world, and then suddenly they're a target because of their magic. So I think that's one of the reasons why I kept it still in there, why it's kind of a little piece on its own. But I also I do like the way it's written, and it's got a slightly different tone, and it's just a bit, yeah. I just really like that piece of writing, so it stayed in. And my editors agreed, so they were just not ruthless enough. So yeah, but it is a bit different.
I'm really glad you kept it in, and I'm also very
Oh.
excited about the possibility of finding a bit more about that type of magic and that little world as well. So yeah, very
Yeah.
excited. Throughout the novel, you combine fictional and historical details. Could you share for us 3 interesting historical facts that you discovered when you were kind of doing the research and thinking about creating your characters and the world of the book?
Okay. So one of the facts that I could share with you is the fact that it is really significant that it is 1855. So in 1854, we have some of the biggest uprisings against indigo cultivation in Bengal. So there's actually a play that is written by a Bengali playwright who has been, you know, indigo kind of ravaged Bengal. So the forced cultivation of indigo resulted in famines that just continued throughout the 19th and 20th century. And in 1854, farmers started to collect together and actually rise up against the East India Company and refuse to grow it anymore. And the playwright who wrote the play Indigo Mirrors actually ended up staging this drama about one family who are impacted by the famine, and the play itself ended up being performed in the fields by farmers. So that is part of the backdrop of what I'm writing about, and actually my story opens with someone coming to Champa's mother because her husband fields are not growing food properly, and they are going to starve. So that as a result of growing indigo. So that's one fact. The other fact that kind of bookends the story is that we're leading up to a moment when everything changes in Bengal, which is 1857, which is the huge uprising of the Indian origin soldiers against the East India Company. They've been employed by them to maintain order across India, and they're actually they rise up against it. And as a result, the East India Company is disbanded, and the British government itself actually steps in to take over control of British India. So that's another historical fact that's there. That is something I'm looking forward towards in this story. And the final historical fact would be that the name, one of my characters, a very beloved character of mine, is called Tipu. And Tipu is named after Tipu Sultan, who was actually an Indian king from the 18th century, but who is a kind of figure who is in the backdrop of this story. And that's why I named my character Tipu, is that there has always been resistance to the British Empire, and Tipu Sultan's objects are actually to be found in the Victoria and Albert Museum because they were taken from his palaces when he was killed by the British in battle in the 18th century. So those are three historical facts that kind of have informed the way I've written this story.
Thank you so much for sharing those. And I think that's something that's done so well in the novel, that combination of kind of the magic and the kind of fantasy elements with the historical elements. I found myself Googling a lot of things alongside it and kind of looking at the history alongside it, which was super interesting.
That's exactly what I hope kids will do. I think of history as breadcrumbs, and a trail of breadcrumbs that you can follow yourself to find out more about the actual events that took place and your own opinions about those. So I really hope that anyone who's curious about any of the things that are in the story will then go out and do their own research, become historians themselves.
I love the idea of breadcrumbs. There's so many children that kind of sprung to mind, children I taught previously, that'd be so interested in kind of delving into parts of history as a result of reading the book. So yeah, I can definitely see that happening in the classroom. One of the other things that noticed that kind of struck me throughout the novel is the impact of fairy tales, the way that's referenced in the book, and the impact that those fairy tales can have on the young Indian characters in the novel. Thinking about reflecting on fairy tales and how useful they are and how they can be used in the classroom, what are your reflections on the usefulness of fairy tales being taught in school to children today?
Well, I'm not that familiar as to how fairy tales are taught in schools and which fairy tales are taught, but from the kind of fairy tales that we have in our, popular culture and the ones that I kind of read growing up, I just found it really fascinating because I learnt Bengali when I was a child, and one of the things I read in Bengali were fairy tales that my grandfather had printed. He was a publisher in Bangladesh, an educational publisher. So he used to post me books in Bengali, and I would read them with my parents to learn how to read Bengali. And so I'd read fairy tales like Aladdin and the 40 Thieves, and and other kind of fairy tales that have similarities or ostensibly the same story, that I'd read in English books of fairy tales, but they'd have like very slightly different kind of ways of being told, different kinds of perspectives, and I think that we're in this world where now we're starting to think about actually. So for a long time, our fairy tales have only come from certain traditions, particularly from the Grimm's kind of set of story tales from Western Europe. So how do we move beyond that? How do we move beyond and use fairy tales from different cultures within the classroom and different versions of the fairy tales that we have, that we can then rework or retell from different perspectives, maybe different characters' perspectives? There's lots of opportunities there for creative writing and creative reimagining in the classroom too, if we start thinking about, actually, where did this actually story originate? Who started telling these kinds of stories? Are there parallel stories from other cultures around the world that we might want to use in conjunction and thinking about them comparatively? that has a lot of potential. And
Yeah, that sounds like a really exciting way to explore fairy tales in the classroom, and something I think often we might think of fairy tales with kind of younger children, but that idea of exploring fairy tales across the world could be definitely something, and reimagining them could be something that could be done with
yeah,
children in Key Stage 2, I can imagine too.
yeah, and we can see from the Disney retellings recently that that there is so much in fairy tales for us to explore in terms of gender, in terms of power. That we have loads of kind of YA books that take us to fairy tale and run with it and give it a full lived world. So yeah, there's lots of opportunities there.
Yeah, really exciting. People listening, please do send in your questions for Nazneen, and we can answer those towards the end as well. So please do send those in. Nazneen, another kind of symbol or feature in the book is the idea of fire, and that's something that's really prominent throughout the text. And thinking about Alia's character, and what does she represent in the novel?
So the character of Alia is a jinn. She's a genie, as you know from the kind of English version of the Persian word jinn. And so she's a spirit, she's a fire spirit. And in the Quran, in the Muslim holy book, jinn do feature in the Quran. And it is said that jinn used to walk the world um, parallel to us so that we could almost they would be in the world, and we could almost see them, but not quite, because they're made of this kind of smokeless flame. And that to me was really interesting, and it kind of corresponded well with the fact that when I would go to Bangladesh see my family in the village my father grew up in, the jinn used to be in the trees. They were real beings that used to cause kind of trouble, and we were warned about them. So for Jin, so the character of Alia is really kind of referencing that kind of uh kind of folklore that is almost real. But fire as well is this kind of really interesting kind of metaphor for power as well. So it is, at the beginning, Jumper, she creates this piece of magic in order to prove to Ummi that she should be allowed to use the magic that she's been born with and that she's really proud of. And she can't control it, and it goes terribly wrong, and it results in this kind of flame that is going to spread through the village and cause devastation. And it kind of creates a whole series of events that results in Chumpa's mother being abducted and the journey she has to go on as a result. So it's about at that big moment, Jumper has this power in fire, but she cannot control it. It's something that she is really proud of, but she also isn't aware of how dangerous it can be. And I guess power wielded by certain people is a damaging, destructive thing. But when we share it, when we learn how to use it and control it, and we use it to raise up those who need it, then it's something that is important and useful. And so to me it's a very useful metaphor for thinking more widely about kind of how do we use power responsibly, how do we share it, how do we use it to bring justice into the world.
Thanks, Nazneen. There's kind of an obvious villain threat in the character of Clive Devane's in the novel, but another threat or kind of theme that comes out is the impact of famine, which kind of goes throughout the novel. And you've already mentioned the how you've drawn upon history and the history of empire and colonialism when creating the text. What are the connections between empire and famine, and why did you choose to make these kind of discrete allusions to famine throughout the novel?
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. I'm really glad to be able to answer this question. So when I was doing my research on migrant communities in 19th century East London, firstly, I wasn't really sure of what I was going to find, particularly about the community that now be described as Bangladeshi, which is a community I'm from. And because that area is known as Banglatown, but it I thought the migration had happened after the Second World War when my father arrived in the 1960s. But actually, what I found was that sailors from a Bangladeshi background, from Bengal, from across India, had been traveling to London for hundreds of years on the Merchant Navy ships. And as a result, a lot of them had jumped ship and made their homes in London, or they'd struggled along in London and sought help. So one of the places that recorded the number of kind of foreign or strange sailors or peoples living in London was actually a missionary called Joseph Salter, and he actually was trying to convert sailors who were Hindu or Muslim who were in London. He was trying to convert them to Christianity by giving them food or helping them out or speaking to them in their languages. But he'd also record the numbers of sailors who were coming into London, and his records and his accounts are part of the London City Mission archives. And I went there and I looked at those archives when I was doing my research on the project. And one of the things I found was that in various years, there were rises in numbers of sailors who were coming in to London and jumping ship in London from South Asia. And there were these big spikes, and then other years there wouldn't be very many. And I went back and I was reading some other histories of famine in India. And when I kind of correlated the two together, it was when the famines were happening in 19th century India that we'd have these huge spikes in South Asian sailors on the ships, and South Asian sailors settling in London because they needed to find another living for to keep their families alive. So we have this really direct connection between famine, migration, and empire. So when we're asking those questions about where are you really from? Why are you here? My answer is always we're here because the British were there, because of the fact of all the different things that happened as a result of colonization, as a result of empire, as a result of enslavement. So those are as soon as we start to really unpack those kinds of historical data, we can really see it in the very kind of very discrete and concrete connections between the two, there. So thank you for asking me that question, because that's something that not everyone knows.
It's so interesting to hear about your process in the research, and that's something that's so evident in the book, how well researched and how much kind of background history and knowledge is kind of explicitly in parts of the book, but also implicitly. So yeah, kind of the allusions to famine being prominent throughout the book is one example, but there's lots in there. So it's really interesting to hear about kind of the in-depth research you've done that really comes through in the book. So kind of related to that, in the classroom, some people would argue that primary school students are perhaps too young to explore historical details related to empire or concepts related to race and racism. However, in your novel, you've got young children fighting for justice. In what ways do you think we can empower students, but also teachers, to challenge prejudice and discrimination through literature?
It's a wonderful question. I think, when we get that suggestion of, that argument that children are too young, well, some children don't get a say. Some children always have to live with those legacies of and traumatic and difficult histories. And so it's important for all of us to kind of learn about it and understand it. It's also the reason why our society looks the way it does. And it explains why we're all here and we're all British. So there's all those reasons that it's really important that we try and find ways to talk about this kind of history. And I hope one day that we will have kind of it becomes statutory, that we learn about colonialism and enslavement, and we move beyond kind of Vikings, who are really exciting, but there's so much more that we could do with our history syllabus. And I know teachers are using literature as a way to do that and supplement that in the absence of those kinds of bigger kind of governmental frameworks. And that's incredible. And so there are books like mine, which are imaginative and speculative retellings that we can use. There are also loads of incredible kind of biographical kind of stories that are coming out. Sufia Ahmed's really incredible story about Nur-Nisa Khan, Nur-Nisa Inayat Khan, the spy princess, the Muslim spy, who was so brave and who died as a result of her work in the Second World War. But we also have other really imaginative stories like the Lizzie and Bell mysteries by Joanna Brand. So we have a lot there that's coming out now that we can use and use as jumping points, really, that in a way that I was talking about breadcrumbs. So for children to find out more by themselves. And I think literature is so important in terms of the fact that it enables us to walk in another's shoes. That sense of empathy that we could develop when we're reading a story from another person's perspective and experience is something that we don't really get through any other form. It's a really, we follow one person's embodied experience through a book, and that means that it can be really transformative. It can really change the way we see the world if we start to understanding what someone feels like when they experience racism. If we've never experienced racism ourselves, we can explore that through a book, and it might make us think about how we choose our words, how we speak, how we treat others. So I think that, for me, literature is a incredibly kind of powerful tool to be using in the kind of search for social justice and the fight for social justice, and at every age. We have some amazing authors coming out now who are really giving us those resources that we can use, whether they be non-fiction, fiction, or poetry, that to speak about these themes at every level.
I completely agree, Nazim. And I think in the discussion, the panel discussion earlier, the primary discussion, there were so many great examples of texts that do that. As you say, that range of, you've got like the fantasy world, non-fiction. There's really great texts available. We need to get them in the hands of the teachers, essentially. And I know that the Lit in Colour have got those lovely book lists, especially for primary. And take a look at, and they're a kind of great springboard to start with.
Yeah, so City and Stolen Magic, Lit in Colour produced a whole set of teaching resources that go with it, and also with Satnam Sangera's book, Stolen History. So if you want to use those in the classroom, then those resources are right there to be used to help you, because I know how difficult it is to produce resources from scratch if you're a teacher. So people there doing these things to make it even easier to get those into the classroom, to have those discussions.
Brilliant. And I was imagining, I think it's such a good book to read aloud. I can really imagine reading it aloud in the classroom because there's so many exciting bits, kind of cliffhanger parts. There's lots of excitement there, and lots of, can you just imagine children wanting to know what happens next?
Originally, there was another prologue that was going to be a section where it's a grandmother talking to her grandchild, and it is about like, this is how we came to England, this is our story. So it's always got that kind of very oral kind of storytelling tone to it, because it's kind of being told in that way. So yeah, I do think it works really well out loud.
One of the earlier you mentioned kind of the possibility of future stories. I was wondering, have you thought about continuing Chompa's story, or perhaps a different book altogether? What are your kind of thoughts or plans at the moment?
So I am working on book 2. It is a series, so I am working on book 2 at the moment, and yes, and again, it's bringing in, I think it's partly because I couldn't fit in all the history that I wanted to explore in this book, but also wanted to work up to 1857 and a fictional version of that. So this book will be 1856, and then there'll be one in 1857. So, and just to give you a little sneak peek, I discovered that there was actually a Hindu queen and an Muslim queen, who were both involved in the uprisings of 1857, not together, but kind of both of them were kind of supporting it in surreptitious ways. One was a direct kind of, she fought alongside soldiers against the British. So I wanted to bring those in. So the idea of rebel queens is really a big theme in the next story, because I have my own rebel queen.
I love that. That's so exciting to hear that there's more to come. That is really, really exciting. And love to get a little sneak preview there about what might be featured there. Thank you so much, Nadine. We've got some questions from the audience now. I think there's still time if people want to. We've got some here, but please do send in more if there's questions. So the first question is, Tankagrupa, the Empress, is now a GCSE play text. And there's a significant amount of intertextuality between your text and the Empress. Could you please comment on this and tell us if you used it as part of your research when writing The City of Stolen Magic?
I really did. I think this is just an amazing. I didn't realize it was on the GCSE syllabus, so that is really exciting to me. I did go to see it when it was first performed, like its first set of performances at Stratford. I think it was in 2015 or 2016. While I was working on my research on East London, and it, one of my colleagues had actually been the historical advisor on the Empress. So it's really, really close. And I had, it was directly in my mind when I was writing City of Stolen Magic. And I do think the scene when they go into the pub and they meet all the peddlers who used to be sailors, it is kind of quite theatrical in its own way. It's like a little mini kind of stage set inside the story. So I think they work really well together. Yeah. Definitely.
Amazing. Someone's asked if there are any other texts that have influenced or you use as part of your research process when crafting the novel.
So the Amitav Ghosh stories, which I can't quite remember the names of now, they were a big influence. Also, I think Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children has always been something that I've always been hugely inspired by. It changed my life when I read that story. But also, I think one of the things is that when I was a child, I was really struck when I read The Secret Garden and Little Princess. And to me, the characters in those stories growing up in the 1980s were Indian girls. They were South Asian, brown-skinned Indian girls. They'd come from India. They were homesick for India. They found England cold and inhospitable. And so I internalized that as being kind of that they were like me. They had that same experience. Also, in the absence of any actual direct stories of British Asian kids in the 1980s. So one of the things was when I reread them and I discovered that they kind of laced with quite a lot of toxic stuff about race and the superiority of kind of British Christianity, for example. It was almost like a negative pushback. Like I was like, okay, like these are the stories we have about India, but I don't want those to be the ones that my kids read. So I mean, I want them to be able to read them critically with something else by them in the same period. So that's kind of one of the inspirations, like the kind of forces pushing me forward to kind of write this story was really that there wasn't that much out there that was really talking about this period, talking about colonialism and its connections to migration and famine, and that I wanted my children to have those tools to be able to make sense of that for themselves. And that's why it's 10 years old. My son's 10. Started writing it when he was actually born, and it was kind of clarifying at the moment. And it's like, I don't want you to have to imagine yourself into stories. I want you to be able to see yourself there directly.
That's amazing, and it's amazing to hear. First of all, how long the process, and you can see the effort and that's gone into the book. But yeah, completely that driving force to be able to let your children see themselves in the book that sounds really important. This is a really interesting question. Someone's asked, since your book's been published, what have young people, but also adults, said to you about the book?
A lot of young people have said they couldn't put it down, which is wonderful, because I think the one, I do want to talk about colonialism. I do want to talk about power. I do want to talk about equity. But I want to do it in a fun way that's appropriate for kids, because I also think that South Asian kids and all kids deserve stories that are fun, exciting, that all kids deserve to have the adventures out there. So to know that my story is one that kids can race through as well because it's exciting, it's really great to know that I'm not preaching to them, that they're having a good time while they're reading it is wonderful. So that's been really wonderful to hear. Yeah, like I've had a lot of feedback from readers who are teachers who are like, I can't wait to read this in class. Exactly that, I'm going to use it as the one we read out loud at the end of the class. And also just that there's a kind of a real love for Jumper, the main character, because she's not perfect. She is a bit spiky. She's a bit impulsive, but some of my readers have really embraced her for all those flaws and her bravery and her kind of her just will to kind of go out there and make a difference has really connected with them. So that's been wonderful.
I can really relate to the sense of wanting to like finish it really quickly and go through it. And as you said earlier, it's quite a chunky book for the kind of age range it's aimed at. But I can imagine children still finishing it really quickly just because they're desperate to read the
Some
next
have
bit.
said they've read it in 24 hours, which I just
Wow.
think is insane. I was like, did you sleep?
Can't put it down. Very impressive. Just take a moment to mention, people mentioned in the chat about kind of tips for using diverse literature in the classroom, and the panel from the teacher discussion earlier put together a top tips document, which is available, and it kind of relates to some of the themes you've mentioned, Nazine, in kind of using the power of literature and using those texts in the classroom. There's also a question about the book being really imaginative. How do you encourage children, young people, to artistically express themselves?
Oh, I love this question. Thank you so much. Because before I started teaching literature at Exeter, and I was actually freelancing as a creative practitioner. So I would go into schools, I would try and, meld together kind of creative writing and history and art to create workshops that were engaging for young people so that they could start to write and develop their own kind of artistic expression. So yeah, I think that I do often encourage young people to think of the question, what if? So I think what if was kind of where I began with this story. So what if, the East India Company actually was trading magic? It was probably the big what if behind City of Stolen Magic. And when I asked that question, suddenly, like, there was another what if question. Okay, so there was, what if then they were trading magical children who had powers, and what if those magical children then rose up against the East India Company? So you can see how, like, you can get this chain reaction of kind of questions that each one of them opens up a pocket of possibility for you to kind of either write or draw or whatever you want to do with that, you've got that there. I think sometimes we focus a lot on perfection, either if it's in terms of handwriting or in terms of grammar. And one of the things that it's wonderful to be able to do as an author or who goes into schools is to actually say, actually, for a moment, let's just hold all that back. Let's just think about this as play. Let's think about of what you want to do in this space, what you want to say, and then we can fix all the other stuff later. And just allow yourself to flow, allow yourself to connect with that part of your brain that you might sometimes gets a bit clouded over when we're really anxious about spelling or handwriting and stuff. So just kind of, I like the kind of ideas of mindfulness and kind of ways in which we can encourage very kind of creative expression and spaces where we can just explore and play imaginatively with words and language, especially. So yeah,
brilliant. Yeah, I think there's some really clear ideas people could take and use in the classroom in English, but also other subjects there to encourage them to think creatively. Brilliant. Someone's put in it, I think we didn't, we kind of glossed over this earlier, to say congratulations on having your book published in India, which is absolutely amazing. So congratulations. How does it feel to have your book published there?
It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing because I did travel to India several times for research over the period that I was writing the book. And, there's actually a parallel museum in Mumbai, which is was opened in the same year as the Victoria and Albert Museum and used to be called the Victoria and Albert Museum. And there they have this very kind of peculiar exhibition of dolls that are all kind of trades or craftspeople of India. And it's actually a little kind of trade exhibition. So we have that kind of like the parallel histories of museums as well. So, and just to have this in the hands of young Indian readers. So next month, it's going to be featured quite prominently in a chain of bookshops there. I was just kind of profiled in one of the national newspapers in India. And it's just incredible to be able to think that, there'll be young Indian readers, young British, Asian and British readers, all reading the same book, all having similar conversations because we're all connected. So that's why it's so exciting.
Oh, that's so exciting. And yeah, and I'm sure they'll be rushing to finish it as quickly as the readers here are as well. So I think you've answered this question already. Somebody has mentioned, just wanted to share this, that they're getting copies of the book for their school, and they wanted to know if you're going to continue the story. So I'm sure they're delighted to hear about that. Brilliant. So the book Wonder was embraced by lots of primary schools for its narrative on fitting in, family, love, identity, friendship, and self-acceptance. Is there a similar book for children of colour that you can think of?
I really love Shana Jackson's books. So I really love God, I can't remember the book title. What's it called?
Is it I've got it off my head. Mystery.
High Rise Mystery.
High Rise
Mystery. Yeah, and I use that in my teaching a lot, even with university students, because I think the way she writes race gentrification is really interesting, but it's also a detective novel, and it's got this like feisty sister duo. It's just got a really amazing, strong sense of place and community. So I think it's a really wonderful resource for primary and kind of year 7, 8 as well. So I think that's one that I would recommend. I think some of the books I recommended earlier, the Spy Princess book is really great by Sophia Ahmed. If you want to think about the Second World War when that's the topic, and then you can kind of use that as a supplement that is actually like, oh, you know what? There were actually a lot of kind of South Asian and African contributions to the First and Second World War that we don't often hear about. So that's another good one to use in that respect.
I agree, and I think one of the really exciting things for me as a teacher, one of the recent developments of kind of historical fiction, which shines a light on kind of underrepresented voices, which is what your book does, and what so many more books are doing now, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
Especially when teachers think about working kind of in a cross-curricular way, and using literature to drive that. That's a really exciting development, kind of recent published in. Brilliant. Nazine, it's been so lovely to hear about your work and your research and all of the effort and thought and that's gone into the book, and it's so exciting to talk to you. I've absolutely loved it. I'm sure so many people are excited to either read the book if they haven't, which they need to do immediately, or use it in the classroom soon. So yeah, very exciting. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and sharing all of the wonderful work you've been doing.
Oh, thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you, everybody. Thank you to Tes and to Lit and Colour for supporting this, and it's just been a wonderful conversation, and I hope people enjoyed it as much as I have.
Amazing. Thanks so much. I'll hand over to Leslie now.
So thank you everyone for attending and engaging with the discussion that we've had here for this primary session of the first ever Lit in Colour Teacher Conference. We'll be sending out the book bundles next month, so please do make sure that you've scanned the QR code so that you can be entered into the prize draw. As mentioned, we have a number of free resources available on penguin.co.uk, also on Tes's Black Experiences Hub, so do check them out. We've got wonderful resources with Nazneen Ahmed Patak, so please do engage with them and see what you can do in your classrooms.
There is a resource for City of Stolen Magic, The Empress, and Girl, Woman, Other. That details some key features of each text if you're considering auditing and amending your curriculums to include one of these texts. The teachers from the reflective sessions have kindly compiled some top tips, as mentioned by Matthew earlier, that they considered while engaging with the process of diversifying their curriculum content. These tips are great for personal use and can also be shared with members of your department. Following the session, we will send an evaluation form. As it's our first Lit in Colour Teacher Conference event, we'd really appreciate it if you would fill it out so that we can use your feedback to inform future events. Thanks again for your time and your engagement, and thank you to Tes, our partner for this event. We hope you have a wonderful start to this new school year and are able to make some meaningful changes to your curriculum and classroom choices. Wish you all the best for this afternoon. Bye-bye.